So Luke, okay, on the education beat, another very active year. Mm-hmm. What's the biggest story?
Well, there are many that stand out, but I think one that really hits me in terms of what its future impact is going to be is the whole issue of the California Voting Rights Act. And this is a story that crossed my beats. It's a city story as well as an education story. But basically, in 2013, in the summer, you had a group of lawyers and some plaintiffs who filed these California Voting Rights Act lawsuits against three different entities here in the city. You had the city, the Santa Clarita Community College District, which runs COC, and the Sulphur Springs School District, basically alleging that their current at-large election systems, which is what many people are familiar with, you go into the booth, there are 3 seats up for election, you vote 3 times. They allege that that system diluted the power of minority residents, particularly Latinos, to impact the election, to have their chosen candidates elected to these seats. And so, those 3 lawsuits were filed, and they were all settled this year in rather quick succession. And then you had one law firm, which was from Malibu, that sent out letters basically threatening additional legal action against a whole host of other local school districts. And so what's happened is, over the course of this past year, the election landscape moving forward for the Santa Clarita Valley has completely changed. Whereas before it was all at-large elections, and that was what everybody had used. Now that's really no longer the case. You basically have local districts falling into 2 primary camps. This idea of district-based or voting area elections, which is what we call it, which is you live in one area, you elect one person to represent that one area, and then you have this idea of cumulative voting, which was something I had frankly never heard of until it was presented as a settlement.
But it's used in other states.
It is used in other states, and that was, I think, if I was going to pick one story that really stood out to me the most from this past year, it'd be a story I did about cumulative voting, where I really, for weeks, I was thinking to myself, I need to explain this to people better. I need to show an example of how this has been used. And so I interviewed people from other states, from Illinois, which used it for its House of Representatives for about 100 years, a version of it, from people from Alabama, people from Texas, to see how this system works in essence. But basically what cumulative voting is it's kind of the same as at-large voting, where if you have 3 seats up for election, you have 3 votes to cast. The difference being that you can cast those however you want. So if I have one candidate that I really like, I can vote 3 times for that one candidate, or 2 times for that one candidate, 1 time for another, or split between all 3. It's a really interesting concept that frankly has not been tried at the level of what the city of Santa Clarita and some local school districts are proposing to do, in California.
Seriously, are people going to understand that?
Well, that will be interesting, and what's particularly going to be interesting moving forward is it's not all cumulative voting. Like I said, now some districts are districts as well. And so I've talked with some elections officials on the county level, because a lot of districts are looking to also move their elections to November of even-numbered years, looking to boost their voter turnout, because even-numbered years you have the races for governor, the races for president. So in theory, more people vote for those sorts of elections. But now there's the possibility that a local voter, could go to the polls and they are looking to cast their ballot for, one thing, and they'll vote at large for a county race, and maybe they'll vote by district for a school board race, and maybe they'll vote by cumulative voting for something different. And what I've been told, by some county election officials is basically they don't think they can put cumulative voting with their voting technology on their ballot.
Wow.
So the way he explained it to me was, you could have somebody walk into one polling place and there's a poll over here where you vote one way for one thing, and then there's another poll over here where you vote a different way for a different thing. And this could be happening on the same day. Or maybe you have even 2 different polling places or different poll workers. So the logistics of how this sort of patchwork quilt that local elections have become, how that's going to be put in place, and how, like you alluded to, local voters are going to be able to sort of wrap their heads around this is going to be really fascinating moving forward.
And reporting it too. It's how have you? This stuff has gotten really complicated, and there's some days that I just say I'm glad I am not Luke Money. Right? Complicated.
Yeah. Well, and it arrived at one of the things as a journalist that you have to do sometimes is report on something But even to report on it, you have to do a lot of legwork to make sure you understand what you're reporting on. And cumulative voting was certainly one of those things where I had to do a lot of interviews, a lot of research just to say, okay, what exactly am I writing about here? Because I've never heard about this. And you're right. I mean, there's sometimes where I wish I could run a flow chart of this district has done this, and this district has done this, and the city's doing this, and they're changing to November of this year, and whatever. Because it really has virtually every district in the valley and the city have changed their election systems in the past year. And so when voters go to the polls, in 2015, they're going to be greeted with almost assuredly an entirely new way of voting. So
It'll be interesting. So next year, there's even going to be more on this, as far as coverage goes for you.
Certainly.
As it kind of ramps up and they actually have to implement this stuff.
Exactly. And if you look statewide, I mean, these sorts of lawsuits, obviously the city of Palmdale was sued before the city of Santa Clarita, and they're continuing their fight in, trying to fight that lawsuit. But you're seeing these sort of suits being filed a lot more commonly throughout California. And in fact, there was even a legislative push that was a bill that would have made it so if you were a city above 100,000 residents, you had to go to district-based elections, in part to avoid these types of alleged violations of the California Voting Rights Act. So, the election landscape locally and statewide is really undergoing a pretty dynamic shift. And as somebody who writes about politics and loves elections, I mean, it's really fascinating for me to try and wrap my head around. But the question comes back down to, how are local voters going to be able to understand all of this when they get to the polls?
Well, it's our job to help them understand as best we can, right?
We're doing our best, I think.
Yes.
But